Sahel nation crossed a line overnight and the cost arrived immediately. One decision reversed months of restraint. As security pressures mounted across the country, alliances recalibrated, and the fragile balance between mercy and survival finally gave way under relentless public scrutiny and wartime urgency without illusions left. What does this mean for stability when Ibrahim Traoré redraws mercy, authority, and the boundaries leaders rarely admit exist in plain sight? A chapter closes now, while consequences begin to ripple outward through institutions, borders, and everyday lives under relentless pressure nationwide. You are about to hear an explanation that most coverage avoids, not because it is unclear, but because it is uncomfortable. This section offers one concrete benefit: a clearer map of what is actually at stake and why recent moves matter beyond headlines. And this is not information meant for casual listening. If you stop here, the story remains easy to misread as personal rivalry or isolated drama. If you stop here, it becomes tempting to frame events as impulsive or symbolic rather than structural and strategic. If you stop here, you inherit a simplified narrative that explains reactions but not causes and outcomes but not risks. Staying with the full picture changes that. It reveals why restraint can become dangerous under certain conditions, how unresolved power struggles distort security decisions, and why timing matters as much as intent. It also clarifies why the current moment is not only about one individual or one arrest, but about whether a state under pressure can close a destabilizing chapter without opening a worse one. Missing this context does not leave a neutral gap. It leaves a false sense of understanding. The first point many missed is that restraint did not reduce pressure. It concentrated it. The second is that the window for quiet resolution narrowed faster than public debate suggested. Within 8 months, a leadership transition intended to stabilize security instead exposed a deeper fault line between authority and accountability, one that could not be patched with symbolism alone. The context matters. Burkina Faso entered 2022 with expanding militant violence, eroding morale inside the armed forces, and communities losing confidence that the state could protect them. The initial promise of order raised expectations quickly, but delivery lagged while attacks continued and territory slipped. That gap between promise and performance became politically radioactive. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré removed the previous leadership, the decision was framed as corrective, not punitive. Exile, not detention, was chosen to avoid bloodshed and signal restraint to domestic audiences and external partners. At the time, that choice reduced immediate friction and bought space to reorganize security priorities. Yet it also left an unresolved center of gravity. A former leader with intact networks, public recognition, and incentives to contest legitimacy from abroad. Why did the situation escalate instead of cooling? Because unresolved authority in a wartime context behaves differently than in peacetime. Signals matter more. Ambiguity invites testing. Every rumor, recording, or whispered plan compounds uncertainty inside institutions already under strain. For soldiers at the front, uncertainty erodes confidence. For civilians, it fuels anxiety. For neighboring states, it creates calculation problems about alignment and risk. The early impact appeared first in discourse, then in behavior. Messages circulated. Loyalties were probed. The idea that exile neutralizes ambition proved optimistic. In parallel, regional dynamics shifted. Cooperation among Sahel states tightened, and tolerance for cross-border destabilization thinned. What looked like a domestic choice began to carry regional consequences. This is the point where Ibrahim Traoré's earlier restraint transformed into a liability. The same mercy that signaled legitimacy also prolonged uncertainty. In a compressed security timeline, delay magnifies cost. By the time decisive action returned to the table, the question was no longer whether restraint was virtuous, but whether it was sustainable. At this stage, the story needs a guide, not to persuade, but to orient. That guide emerged not as a commentator, but as a decision-maker forced to read the terrain as it was, not as it was hoped to be. Ibrahim Traoré did not enter the moment with the luxury of abstraction. He inherited a state under attack, a military demanding clarity, and a public measuring leadership by outcomes rather than tone. The first early impact appeared inside the security apparatus. Officers who initially welcomed restraint began to question whether ambiguity was becoming a strategic weakness. In internal discussions, the concern was not ideology, but predictability. A chain of command cannot function when past authority remains unresolved. The presence of a formal leader abroad, active and vocal, complicated discipline and blurred lines of loyalty at precisely the moment unity mattered most. A second impact surfaced beyond the barracks. Civilians, already living with displacement and fear, interpreted continued ambiguity as a hesitation. Markets react to confidence before policy. So do communities. As rumors circulated and regional media amplified speculation, trust thinned. What had once looked like patience began to resemble drift. For Traoré, these signals converged into a single conclusion. Legitimacy built through restraint must eventually be protected through closure. The choice was no longer between mercy and force in moral terms, but between uncertainty and decisiveness in practical ones. Leadership in crisis rarely announces itself with drama. It reveals itself through the willingness to absorb criticism in exchange for stability. From that moment, the narrative shifted. The question ceased to be whether mercy was admirable. It became whether delay was defensible. And that reframing moved the entire story onto a different plane. The trigger did not announce itself with a single headline. It began quietly, then accelerated. Messages surfaced from exile. Old contexts were tested. Assurances were sought, then withdrawn. What had looked contained started to move. In a security environment already compressed by daily threats, even small signals carried weight. Each rumor landed like a stress test on institutions still rebuilding. The early reactions were cautious. Officials monitored rather than moved. Channels stayed open. The calculation was familiar. Time might cool ambition, distance might dilute influence. Yet the opposite unfolded. Distance sharpened intent. From abroad, narratives hardened. Recordings circulated. Statements hinted at unfinished business. The past did not fade. It reorganized. Pressure mounted inside the armed forces. Frontline units asked for clarity, not speeches. They needed to know where authority began and ended. Every unresolved question multiplied risk. As attacks continued, patience thinned. The cost of ambiguity was no longer theoretical. It appeared in morale, coordination, and trust. Then escalation followed its own logic. Networks reactivated. Allegiances were probed. The line between political contestation and security threat blurred. Regional actors took notice. No neighboring state wanted to become a platform for destabilization, especially as coordination among Sahel governments tightened. Calculations shifted from courtesy to consequence. At this point, momentum overtook intent. Events stacked quickly. Diplomatic conversations turned firm. Quiet understandings replaced public ambiguity. The message was consistent. Unresolved power struggles travel faster than borders can contain them. Stability demanded closure. The aftershocks arrived almost immediately. Debate intensified at home. Critics warned of overreach, supporters warned of the delay, yet the frame had changed. The issue was no longer personal rivalry, but the institutional survival. In wartime conditions, unfinished transitions behave like open wounds. They drain attention, invite interference, and consume credibility. For Ibrahim Traoré, the sequence narrowed options. Mercy had already been extended. Its signal had been received. What followed was not revenge, but risk management. The decision to act closed a loop that had remained dangerously open. It drew a line not against dissent, but against perpetual uncertainty. Once that line was drawn, consequences rippled outward. Diplomacy recalibrated. Regional cooperation hardened. The precedent shifted. Exile was no longer immunity. And a chapter that lingered in the background moved finally toward resolution. To understand why the decision hardened, it helps to shift from narrative to measurement. The baseline was a state already under strain. The delta was how quickly uncertainty multiplied its costs. Before restraint was tested, security planning assumed a single center of authority. After exile without closure, planners had to factor in an external variable that could not be modeled away. The first quantitative anchor is time. In less than a year, Burkina Faso experienced 2 leadership transitions while facing sustained militant pressure. In security terms, that compression matters. Transitions normally absorb months of recalibration. Here, recalibration overlapped with active conflict. The delta is not just speed, but overlap. Governance change plus wartime operations. That overlap raises coordination risk and lowers tolerance for ambiguity. The second anchor is scope. Attacks and displacement were not localized events affecting one corridor or one province. They spread across multiple regions, stretching logistics and command structures. When influence from exile entered the equation, even as rumor, it increased the number of scenarios commanders had to consider. More scenarios mean slower decisions. Slower decisions mean higher exposure. The baseline of high threat became a delta of compounded threat. The third anchor centers on human impact. Soldiers at the front measure leadership by consistency. Civilians measure it by safety and predictability. When messages circulate suggesting unfinished power struggles, trust erodes faster than policy can repair it. The measurable effect appears indirectly. Reduced cooperation, increased anxiety, and a widening gap between official statements and lived experience. These are not abstract metrics, but indicators that security systems track closely. Another measurable dimension is regional response. Neighboring states adjusted posture as coordination among Sahel governments intensified. The tolerance threshold for hosting destabilizing actors dropped, diplomatic language hardened from permissive to conditional. This shift is a delta from earlier periods when exile often functioned as a safety valve. Now exile increasingly functions as a liability. Put together, the numbers are not just counts, but relationships. Short timelines plus wide scope plus human stress create nonlinear risk. In such conditions, mercy without resolution carries a measurable cost. Each additional week of ambiguity increases the probability of miscalculation. Each signal from abroad amplifies internal friction. Each delay compounds uncertainty. This is why the decision point arrived abruptly. Not because values changed, but because measurements did. The baseline assumption that restraint would stabilize no longer matched observable trends. The delta pointed in the opposite direction. For a state under pressure, ignoring that divergence would have meant accepting escalating risk as the price of patience. By the time action was taken, the data-driven conclusion was unavoidable. Stability required closure, not as punishment, but as risk reduction. When numbers move against you, leadership adjusts. And in this case, adjustment meant drawing a definitive line where ambiguity had become too costly to sustain. There is a serious counter-argument that deserves to be presented at its strongest. It begins with the claim that restraint and exile reduce violence by lowering the temperature after power shifts. According to this view, detaining former leaders risks turning political rivalry into martyrdom, provoking backlash, and hardening opposition. Stability, the argument goes, is better served by allowing defeated figures to fade from relevance abroad while institutions consolidate at home. That position is not frivolous. In many transitions, exile has prevented immediate bloodshed and created space for reorganization. It can reassure external partners, preserve diplomatic channels, and signal that leadership is not driven by vengeance. From this angle, the moral high ground is also strategic capital, one that can be spent later, when cooperation is needed. The second counterpoint focuses on precedent. Critics warn that bringing former leaders back under pressure sets a norm that future transitions will mirror. If every transfer of a power risks retroactive accountability, incentives to step aside peacefully diminish. Leaders may cling longer, resist harder, or escalate conflicts they might otherwise concede. In fragile states, that risk is not theoretical. Both arguments are coherent. Both assume, however, a peacetime logic applied to a wartime context. The missing variable is timing under threat. Exile reduces risk when influence decays faster than pressure. It fails when influence reorganizes faster than institutions can stabilize. In this case, signals from abroad did not fade. They intensified. Networks did not dissolve. They probed. The moral signal of restraint remained intact, but the operational signal became ambiguous. Precedent also cuts both ways. Allowing unresolved authority to persist during active conflict sets its own norm. That external positioning can challenge internal command without consequence. That norm carries cost measured in hesitation, divided loyalties, and delayed decisions. Over time, those costs accumulate quietly, then suddenly. When both sides are placed on the table, the picture sharpens. Restraint is stabilizing when it closes chapters. It is destabilizing when it leaves them open. Accountability is risky when it escalates conflict. It is protective when it ends it. The distinction lies not in intention, but in context and sequence. Seen this way, the choice was less about punishing the past than about preventing its continuous interference with the present. The strongest counter-arguments remain valid in principle. They simply fail to match the conditions on the ground. And when principle diverges from reality, leadership is judged by outcomes, not elegance. And then the direction changed. What followed was not louder rhetoric or dramatic speech, but a shift in posture that recalibrated the entire equation. Information that had circulated at the margins moved to the center. What once looked like isolated signaling began to resemble a coordinated attempt to reinsert the past into the present. At that moment, the issue ceased to be theoretical. It became operational. The reveal was not a single document or event, but a convergence. Recordings, contacts, and regional reactions aligned into a clearer picture of intent. The assumption that time abroad would neutralize ambition no longer held. Instead, distance appeared to provide space to reorganize narratives and test loyalties without direct exposure. That realization altered the risk profile immediately. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was the pivot. The earlier framework of patience and symbolic restraint no longer matched the reality taking shape. What had been managed as a political after-effect now registered as a security variable. Once that reclassification occurred, the logic of response changed with it. The impact of this midpoint shift was decisive. Decisions accelerated, diplomatic ambiguity narrowed, regional coordination solidified around a shared understanding that unresolved authority could not be allowed to linger during active conflict. The story moved from monitoring to action, from tolerance to limits. Crucially, this turn did not close the narrative. It opened a deeper layer. If restraint could transform into risk, what else had been misread? And if one decision reshaped the balance so quickly, what consequences would follow once its effects reached beyond leadership circles? From here on, the surface story was no longer enough. The real test would appear where decisions touched everyday reality. The consequences did not remain abstract for long. Once the midpoint shift translated into action, effects surfaced where policy meets daily reality. Decisions taken at the top began to register across institutions, markets, communities, and borders, each layer reacting according to its own logic, but tied to the same source. For the state, the immediate impact was pressure and consolidation at the same time. Authorities faced sharper scrutiny, both domestically and regionally, over the balance between firmness and legitimacy. Security agencies were pushed to clarify chains of command, close loopholes, and demonstrate coherence under stress. That clarity carried a cost in criticism, but it also reduced internal ambiguity. In crisis governance, predictability is a form of power. The state absorbed short-term backlash in exchange for a clear operational horizon. Businesses felt the shift through risk perception. Investment decisions, supply routes, and labor planning respond quickly to signals about stability. Prolonged uncertainty discourages commitment more effectively than bad news does. As ambiguity narrowed, some sectors recalibrated cautiously. Others paused. The message to markets was not comfort, But definition, defined risk, even when elevated, is easier to manage than indeterminate risk. For commerce, that distinction matters. For ordinary people, the impact got closer to home. Communities living with insecurity measure leadership by tangible outcomes. Fewer disruptions, clearer communication, and a sense that tomorrow will not be more chaotic than today. Rumors about unresolved power struggles feed anxiety faster than official reassurances can counter it. When those rumors were addressed decisively, fear did not vanish, but it changed character. Uncertainty shifted toward expectation. That shift alters behavior, from cooperation with authorities to daily planning decisions. At the regional level, the ripple effects were unmistakable. Neighboring states adjusted posture, calculating alignment within an increasingly coordinated Sahel framework. Hosting destabilizing actors became less tolerable as collective security logic hardened. The message extended beyond one case. Borders would no longer function as buffers for unresolved internal conflicts. Regional diplomacy moved from informal tolerance to conditional cooperation. Across these layers, the same pattern repeated. Uncertainty receded, replaced by sharper lines. That replacement did not guarantee positive outcomes, but it changed incentives. Actors adjusted to a new baseline where ambiguity carried higher cost than decisiveness. In that environment, neutrality became harder to sustain. For Ibrahim Traoré, the consequences were therefore twofold. Politically, the move narrowed his margin for error. Once limits are declared, consistency becomes mandatory. Strategically, it reduced the number of competing signals confronting institutions already under strain. The trade-off was visible. Less room for maneuver, but fewer moving targets. The broader lesson is not that firmness automatically produces stability. It is that unresolved transitions impose hidden taxes across society. They tax trust, coordination, and time. When those taxes accumulate, they are paid unevenly, often by those least able to absorb them. By this stage, one conclusion had become difficult to avoid. The effects were no longer confined to leadership circles. They had spread through the state, the economy, daily life, and the region. Once that spread occurs, no actor remains untouched and no decision remains isolated from its consequences. The most likely path forward is not dramatic, but disciplined. Under this base scenario, institutions consolidate around the new limits that have been set, while security operations continue under sustained pressure. The pace of change remains uneven. Some areas see incremental gains in coordination and morale, while others lag under resource constraints. Political debate does not disappear, but it shifts from uncertainty about authority to scrutiny of results. Stability improves at the margins, not through calm, but through routine. A more optimistic scenario depends on follow-through. If clearer authority translates into better coordination, and if regional cooperation continues to harden against cross-border destabilization, pressure could ease gradually. Improved predictability encourages cautious economic re-engagement, and communities regain a measure of confidence as signals align more consistently. This outcome requires restraint to be paired with transparency and firmness to be matched by performance. It is attainable, but not automatic. The worst-case scenario emerges if decisiveness stops at symbolism. If limits are declared but inconsistently enforced, credibility erodes faster than before. Critics gain traction, institutions fragment under competing expectations, and security gains stall. In this path, firmness without capacity becomes another form of instability, inviting renewed challenges rather than deterring them. The costs rise and the margin for correction narrows. What matters most is not predicting which scenario will prevail, but recognizing that all three remain possible. Outcomes hinge on execution, consistency, and the ability to adapt as conditions change. The future is less about choosing a narrative than about managing consequences as they unfold, step by step, under sustained pressure. After tracing the wider picture and the scenarios ahead, the question narrows naturally to you, the person listening now. Once the regional dynamics, institutional pressures, and leadership choices are clear, The next step is understanding how this story intersects with individual perspective and responsibility. For those who actively follow security and political developments, the advantage is awareness. You see patterns earlier and recognize signals before they harden into outcomes. That advantage carries a responsibility to stay critical. Rapid shifts reward attention, but punish certainty. The more closely you follow events, the more important it becomes to separate confirmed movement from speculation and to update assumptions as conditions change. For those indirectly affected, the impact is quieter, but persistent. Economic uncertainty, rising costs and shifts in regional stability travel through jobs, prices, and long-term planning. Even without direct involvement, these dynamics shape opportunity and risk. Awareness here is not about obsession, but preparedness. Adjusting expectations and planning with volatility in mind is a form of agency, not alarm. For those who feel detached, the temptation is to dismiss the story as distant or temporary. That distance can feel protective, but it is often misleading. Structural changes rarely announce when they will touch everyday life. By the time effects become obvious, options are fewer and reactions are more costly. Minimal engagement, at least enough to grasp the direction of change, reduces that vulnerability. Across all three groups, the common thread is choice. Attention does not require agreement, engagement does not demand activism, but understanding shifts the balance from reaction to anticipation. In periods of uncertainty, that shift matters. This story is not asking for alignment, it is offering context, and context once absorbed changes how future decisions are read, evaluated, and acted upon. Solutions cannot remain slogans when pressure is sustained. At this stage, the question is no longer what should have been done, but what can still be done to reduce risk and prevent recurrence. That requires a sequence of actions that align authority, capacity, and accountability. The first step sits at the center of power. National leadership must translate declared limits into consistent practice. That means clear legal framing, predictable enforcement, and communication that reduces speculation rather than feeding it. For Ibrahim Traoré, this phase is about proving that decisiveness is procedural, not personal. Success here is measured by fewer contradictory signals, faster internal coordination, and declining space for rumor-driven instability over the coming months. The second step involves institutions and systems that operate below the political surface. Security forces, judicial bodies, and administrative agencies need synchronized rules of engagement and defined responsibilities. Ambiguity between institutions is as damaging as ambiguity at the top. Progress is measured not by announcements, but by execution indicators, response times, coordination outcomes, and the absence of parallel chains of influence that undermine command integrity. The third step belongs to society. Communities and individuals cannot stabilize a system alone, but they influence its resilience. Practical actions matter more than grand gestures. Following verified information, resisting rumor amplification, and maintaining civic cooperation all reduce friction during transition periods. Change at this level is measured by behavior, calmer public discourse, higher compliance with lawful processes, and reduced tolerance for destabilizing narratives. A fourth step, where possible, extends outward. Regional cooperation should remain structured and conditional, reinforcing the principle that borders are not tools for unresolved power struggles. Joint monitoring and diplomatic clarity are the metrics here, not symbolic declarations. The common thread across all steps is implementation. Policies that remain abstract decay quickly under pressure. Only actions that are repeatable and observable alter trajectories. The path forward depends less on intent than on discipline, and less on rhetoric than on follow-through. The story circles back to the moment when leadership stopped speaking in abstractions and began absorbing consequences. The image is not of a speech or a ceremony, but of a decision taken with full awareness of its costs made under pressure that allowed little margin for delay. That image matters because it anchors everything that followed. From the first signs of restraint to the point where limits were drawn, the journey was not linear, expectations rose, patience stretched, and ambiguity lingered longer than many anticipated. Over time, the weight of that ambiguity accumulated quietly, until it pressed against institutions, morale, and public confidence all at once. What felt gradual in real time now appears compressed in hindsight. Placed within that arc, Ibrahim Traoré's role reads less as a dramatic pivot and more as a reckoning with sequence. Mercy came first, and legitimacy with it. Discipline followed, not as a reversal of values, but as their protection under changing conditions. The emotional center of the story lies in that tension, holding restraint long enough to prove intent, then ending it quickly enough to prevent erosion. This is not merely a political episode. It is a reminder that leadership is often judged where intention collides with timing. Decisions acquire meaning not only from what they are, but from when they are taken and what they close off. The lasting question is not whether the choice was comfortable, but whether it was necessary. In moments like this, history rarely rewards elegance. It remembers clarity. As this story settles, it is worth acknowledging that each listener will take something different from it. Some will focus on security logic, others on precedent, others on the human cost of prolonged uncertainty. All of those readings can coexist, because this was never a simple narrative with a single takeaway. If you believe this perspective helps clarify more than it inflames, consider letting others encounter it in the same spirit, not to persuade, but to broaden understanding. Stories like this gain value when they move beyond reaction and become part of a wider, calmer conversation about responsibility, timing, and consequence. What matters most now is dialogue that stays grounded. Questions asked in good faith often reveal more than answers delivered with certainty, whether you agree with every choice described here or not. Reflecting on how decisions are made under pressure sharpens collective judgment. So here is the question to leave open, not as a verdict, but as an invitation. When stability and restraint collide under real threat, where should the line truly be drawn?